Hey, I'm Stephan Papadakis. We're here at Papadakis Racing. Today we're going to build our new billet intake manifold for our 2020 GR Supra. We've been drifting this car all year already. We've already made 1,000 horsepower with this engine, but we're always evolving the engine setup in the car as well, and this is one of those things that's going to be with us for the rest of the season. Let's get started and build it now.
So the intake manifold consists of several pieces. We've got the runner section that bolts to the cylinder head, what we call the plenum base or the base plate, a velocity stack, and then the plenum. And essentially what an intake manifold does is it takes the air coming in from the single throttle body and distributes it into the 6 cylinders. And this intake manifold is made out of aluminum, all CNC machined. So the first thing we'll do is we'll start by bolting the base plate to the runners. So there wasn't a lot of room to put an O-ring where the base plate attaches to the runners. So for this part, we're just going to put some silicone, and that's going to work well. And I'll go ahead and prep all of the bolts with some blue Loctite. And these are just some small 4mm bolts, which normally is not very strong, but when you have 48 of them, it's strong enough to keep the plenum and the intake manifold together. So I'll get them all started, hand tight, make sure everything's aligned properly, and then go ahead and snug them down. And one of the reasons the intake manifold is so many pieces is because we have to be able to make the part. So whenever we're designing a component, we have to think about how to manufacture it. And not only the ability to manufacture it, but also the cost as well. We figured that the best way to do this would be have separate pieces where we have the runner, the base plate, and the plenum. And we didn't know how big we wanted the plenum to be, which is the part where the air gets distributed into the runners. Depending on the engine size, you can have different size plenums. And there's different theories on the ideal plenum size. Typically, it's around the displacement of the engine. So for us, we have a 3.2 liter engine. You might want a 3.2 liter plenum, but sometimes you can get away with a little bit smaller plenum and sometimes larger. And the way that we decided we're going to test this is we have these spacers, and depending on how many spacers or no spacer at all, we can change the plenum dimension. And we'll just go to the dyno, test that on the dyno, and see which makes the most power. So the plate has a whole bunch of counterbore features that align with all of the bolts that hold the plate to the runners. That way, if something happens to come loose, it'll stay captured within that plate. And then the bolts that hold the plate on come from the outside. So that way, if those come loose, they just fall out. But we're going to continue to Loctite everything, so hopefully nothing comes loose. The surface where the plenum mates to the base plate is where we have the O-ring. We have a groove cut here where the O-ring is going to sit. And that's what's going to seal the base plate to the plenum. And this O-ring is made out of a material called Viton. And the Viton material does a good job of not only sealing, but it can deal with the E85 ethanol fuel that we use in the car. Other O-rings, a lot of the stuff that comes on normal engines, doesn't do that well with the ethanol, and it can swell up. So the next time you take it apart, the O-ring won't fit anymore, and you have to replace it. But this one should last a while. And the way you turn this O-ring cord stock into something usable is you figure out exactly the length you want, you cut it nice and square with a razor blade, and then you super glue it. And believe it or not, it's very reliable, and we've been gluing O-rings for years. But you can only do it in like sandwich plates like this. If we just put the O-ring in the groove, it may fall out. So we use this O-ring silicone, and what the O-ring silicone does is it makes it tacky, and the O-ring will now stick in that profile. So once we put the plate on and put it all together, we don't have to worry about the O-ring coming out a little bit, not being lined up and potentially getting smashed. Again, we'll Loctite all those bolts and then put the plenum on the base plate. For now, we're just going to start with no base plate, so the minimum plenum volume. And then later, another day, we'll go to the dyno and bring those plates with us and then try those different plenum volume spacers and then see which one makes the most power. So instead of having the throttle body bolt pattern directly onto the plenum, I decided to make this plenum spacer adapter. And that way, we're not really married to this throttle body. In the future, if we want to use a different throttle body, we can just make a different spacer and then adapt that new throttle body's bolt pattern to the existing one on the plenum. The O-ring between the throttle body spacer and the plenum is something that is just normally off the shelf. And what I did was I looked at the available O-rings and just made the diameter of the feature where the O-ring fits into match the existing O-ring availability. So now with the adapter on there, you can see how it adapts the 4 bolts on the plenum to the 3 bolts on our GR Supra throttle body. And this is just the factory GR Supra O-ring. And that way we can just bolt it on pretty easy and it's going to seal up nicely. Next, we'll get all the fuel injectors in. These are 2,000 cc injectors. Typically, most street cars are somewhere between 200 to maybe 300 or 400 cc's. So these are substantially larger than most street car injectors. That way we can have 1,000 plus horsepower worth of fuel in just these 6 injectors. The O-rings seal into the injector bosses with O-rings again, and the rail is straightforward. It's held on with these brackets. The brackets ended up being relatively close to the fuel rail. So what we did is we modified some bolts to be a bit narrower so they could fit in that area. Now that we've got the intake manifold all assembled, we can go ahead and put it on the engine. But before we do that, I've got to make more O-rings for each one of the runners. And the way we decided to design this one, instead of having a gasket in between the intake manifold and the head, it's just going to use O-rings for each one of the individual cylinders. So I'll go through the same process of figuring out the length I want, cutting it with a razor blade, and then gluing them. Now that we're all on, we can start it up and go test.
All right, so thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please hit the like button. If you want to see more, please consider subscribing, and we'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.